The early morning sun barely pierced through the clouds as Lucy Collins, 76 years old, sat on the edge of her small, worn-out couch. For the past few weeks, she'd felt an uncomfortable tightening in her abdomen, but today was different. The pain had become unbearable. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she gripped the armrest, trying to steady herself. Her family had gone to the local market for groceries, leaving her alone in their modest Los Angeles home. Unaware of how bad things had gotten for her, Lucy knew she couldn't wait any longer. With a shaking hand, she grabbed her coat and purse, determined to reach the hospital on her own. The streets of Los Angeles were busy, even in the early hours. Each step was a battle against the searing pain in her stomach. Her vision blurred as she made her way down the sidewalk. At one point, she stumbled, falling hard onto the pavement. The impact tore her clothing and left her palms bleeding. But the worst part was how the pain in her abdomen spiked even more. She could barely stand. As she continued to limp toward the hospital, people passed by, some giving her looks of disdain, others ignoring her completely. Her clothes, once clean and neatly pressed, were now soiled from the fall. By the time Lucy reached the emergency room, she felt more like a shadow of herself, nearly collapsing at the entrance. Inside the hospital, the chaos of a typical emergency room in Los Angeles greeted her. Patients crying out in pain, nurses rushing from one end to the other, the sound of beeping monitors echoing through the sterile hallways. Lucy stepped up to the reception desk, her voice barely audible as she tried to explain her condition. But before she could finish her sentence, a tall, stern-faced doctor appeared, Sara Woods. Sara glanced briefly at Lucy, her eyes sweeping over the disheveled woman. "Another one off the streets," Sara muttered under her breath. Her expression hardened, and she motioned for a nurse without even making eye contact with Lucy. "Get her cleaned up and then have her wait. We'll get to her when we can," Sara said, turning her attention back to her tablet, typing with an air of impatience. Lucy, too weak to argue, was ushered into a corner of the waiting room by the nurse. Her mind swam with confusion. Why wasn't anyone taking her seriously? The pain gnawing at her insides was getting worse, but it seemed that no one here even noticed. Hours passed, and every second felt like an eternity. Her frail body trembled as she tried to hold on, but deep inside, Lucy knew something was terribly wrong. As she waited, the emergency room continued its frantic rhythm. More patients arrived, some escorted by paramedics, others limping in just like Lucy had. Through her haze of pain, Lucy couldn't help but notice the sharp contrast in how they were treated. Some were immediately seen, whisked away to private rooms. But she was invisible, just another forgotten face. At that moment, Dr. Ethan Reyes, who had been observing the room quietly, noticed Lucy. Something about her caught his eye. He had seen many patients from all walks of life, and his instincts told him that this wasn't just a case of an old woman in mild discomfort. He approached her with a cautious, gentle tone. "Ma'am, how long have you been waiting?" he asked, kneeling beside her as her pale, trembling hands clutched her abdomen. "Too long. It hurts so much," Lucy whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Ethan examined her briefly and immediately recognized the signs of something far more serious than anyone had considered. The sweat on her brow, the sharp, irregular breathing, the swollen stomach. This wasn't just a minor complaint. Ethan's heart sank as he realized what might be happening. "We need to get her in immediately," he told a nearby nurse, urgency rising in his voice. Sara, overhearing Ethan's concern, walked over, frowning as she crossed her arms. "She's just another street case, probably looking for painkillers," she said dismissively. But Ethan wasn't having it. He shot her a look that silenced any further objections. "She's not homeless. Look at her clothes. They're torn, but not old or dirty like someone living on the streets. This is serious, Sara. We need to run tests now." Sara blinked, suddenly unsure. Her usual confidence wavered as Ethan's words sank in. She had been too quick to judge, too quick to assume. Ethan wasted no time as he instructed the team to prepare for an emergency evaluation. He had a gut feeling they were dealing with something much worse than Sara's initial assumption. Lucy was quickly wheeled into an examination room, the tension in the air thickening as Ethan and the medical team sprang into action. The clock was ticking, and Lucy's life now hung in the balance. Dr. Ethan Reyes quickly mobilized the medical team. Lucy was immediately taken to the diagnostic unit for a full scan. The quiet panic in the room was palpable. Everyone knew they were dealing with something critical. Ethan's sharp instincts were usually spot on, and this time was no different. As they prepared to take Lucy in for a CT scan, he reviewed her symptoms in his head: abdominal pain, vomiting, extreme weakness. It all pointed to something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Meanwhile, Sara Woods remained at her station, but her thoughts were tangled. She had dismissed Lucy so easily, so quickly. There was no denying that. All it took was one glance at the woman's torn clothes, dirt-streaked skin, and frail appearance, and Sara had instantly placed her in a category: another homeless person, another addict trying to get through the door for painkillers. It wasn't the first time she had made this kind of judgment, but for some reason, this time it stung a little more. As she watched Ethan work, she felt an unfamiliar sense of doubt creep in. Had she been wrong? It wasn't like her to question herself, but Ethan's insistence had triggered something. Maybe it was the way he looked at Lucy with such empathy and care, something Sara realized she hadn't done in a long time. Not since her first year as a doctor, when she still believed she could change the world one patient at a time. The CT scan results came back faster than expected. As Ethan studied the images, his stomach churned. There was a rupture in Lucy's intestines. It was far worse than he had anticipated. If they didn't act immediately, Lucy could go into septic shock, and the consequences would be fatal. Without hesitation, Ethan made the call for emergency surgery. His hands moved with precision as he briefed the team, his voice steady and commanding. "We don't have time to waste. Prep Theor now." Sara stood just outside the room, observing everything in silence. When she saw the images, she felt her breath catch in her throat. This was not a case of simple abdominal pain or a minor infection. This was life-threatening, and she had almost let Lucy die in the waiting room. A surge of guilt washed over her, but she quickly pushed it aside. She was too busy for guilt right now. As Lucy was prepped for surgery, Ethan approached Sara. His eyes, usually so calm and composed, now flickered with intensity. "We're going in now," he said. "We've got a rupture in the intestines. I need you to scrub in." Sara blinked in surprise. He wanted her in the operating room. After everything that had happened? "Are you sure?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I mean, don't you have this covered?" Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "I'm sure," he said firmly. "This is serious, and I need the best on this. We can't afford any mistakes." The words hit her harder than she expected. Ethan trusted her, even after she had misjudged Lucy so badly. There was no time to think about what that meant. So Sara nodded and went to scrub in. As they prepared for surgery, the atmosphere was tense. Every member of the surgical team knew they were on borrowed time. As Lucy lay unconscious on the table, the reality of the situation hit Sara hard. This was a woman who had lived a full life, who had probably seen more hardship than Sara could imagine. She had children, a family, a home. And Sara had nearly thrown that away because of a careless assumption. The weight of her own arrogance felt heavy in the sterile room. She had always prided herself on being efficient, on moving quickly. But now she realized she had become too quick to judge, too quick to dismiss. Ethan was focused, his hands moving swiftly as they opened Lucy's abdomen. The rupture was worse than expected, and the infection was spreading fast. He worked with meticulous care, every movement deliberate, every decision critical. Sara assisted him, her mind racing. She had performed surgeries like this before, but never under these emotional circumstances. She felt like she had something to prove, not just to Ethan, but to herself. The minutes stretched on, the silence in the operating room broken only by the steady hum of machines and the occasional instruction from Ethan. The team worked seamlessly, moving as one. But for Sara, every second felt like a test of her skill, her judgment, and her ability to make things right. As they closed up Lucy's abdomen and completed the procedure, a sense of relief washed over the room. The surgery had gone as well as they could have hoped, but the next few hours would be critical. Lucy would need to be monitored closely to ensure the infection was fully under control and that her body could begin to heal. Sara stepped back, peeling off her gloves and staring at her reflection in the glass of the operating room door. She had done her job. She had performed the surgery. But the question gnawed at her. Was that enough? Could she undo the damage she had caused by nearly ignoring Lucy's cries for help? Ethan gave her a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the work they had done. "We'll know more in a few hours," he said, his voice calm again. "But we did everything we could." Sara nodded, but the guilt still lingered. She wasn't sure if anything would ever feel the same after this. She wasn't sure she deserved to be forgiven. Lucy Collins was stable but far from out of danger. The hours following surgery were critical, and the medical team watched her every vital sign closely. Dr. Ethan Reyes had done all he could, but the infection had spread rapidly before they could intervene. Now, it was up to Lucy's body to respond to the treatment, to fight back against the damage caused by the intestinal rupture. The surgical lights were off, the tools cleaned and stored, but the weight of what had transpired in the last few hours lingered in the hospital corridors like an echo. Sara Woods walked slowly down the hall, her mind racing, though her face remained calm. She was used to pressure, to making split-second decisions. Yet, something about this case had unnerved her. Perhaps it was because she had been so close to dismissing Lucy as just another lost cause, so certain in her assumption that the elderly woman was someone to ignore. Now, after standing by Ethan through the surgery, after seeing how close Lucy had come to death, Sara felt something unfamiliar, a deep sense of shame. She reached the break room, sat down, and stared at the floor, her hands still trembling slightly. Sara had been in the medical field long enough to know that mistakes happen, even to the best doctors. But this wasn't a technical error. It was a failure of empathy. She had been too wrapped up in the constant rush of emergency room life, too quick to write Lucy off because of her appearance. And now, if Lucy didn't pull through, Sara would have to live with the knowledge that she had almost let her die without even trying to understand her pain. As Sara sat in silence, Ethan entered the room. He looked at her, noticing the weight she carried in her posture, the way her shoulders slumped, her usually sharp eyes dulled with regret. He didn't need to ask her what was on her mind. He knew. Instead, he grabbed 2 cups of coffee, handing one to her as he sat across the table. "She's stable for now," Ethan said quietly, taking a slow sip from his cup. "But we'll need to watch her closely. These next 24 hours are going to be tough for her." Sara nodded, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her own coffee. She could feel Ethan's eyes on her, waiting for her to speak. Finally, after a long pause, she sighed. "I almost let her go, Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't even look twice. I just assumed." Ethan didn't interrupt. He let the words hang in the air between them, giving Sara the space she needed to process. She looked up, meeting his calm, steady gaze. "How did you know?" she asked. "How did you see something that I miss?" Ethan shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know if it's about knowing, really. It's more about feeling. I've learned that no matter how rushed things get, no matter how many patients come through the door, we can't afford to stop feeling. It's easy to get caught up in assumptions, especially in a place like this. But we owe it to people to give them more than just a glance." His words settled over her, like a gentle reminder of something she had once known, but had forgotten along the way. Sara had always been good at her job, technically flawless, quick under pressure, but somewhere in the chaos of the emergency room, she had lost sight of why she became a doctor in the first place. She had always wanted to help people, to heal them, but now she realized she had become numb to their pain. I don't know if I can come back from this, she admitted quietly. I mean, what if she doesn't make it? Ethan leaned back, his eyes soft but serious. You don't get to choose the outcome, Sara. None of us do. But you do get to choose what you do next. And that starts by showing up, by caring. That's where it begins. Sara took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe she could learn from this, be better because of it. She wasn't sure how yet, but Ethan was right. The road ahead wasn't about perfection. It was about doing the best she could for every patient that walked through those doors, no matter who they were or what they looked like. The next few hours passed slowly. Lucy's condition was touch and go. The infection had weakened her body, and her immune system was struggling to keep up. As night fell, Sara and Ethan took turns checking on her, monitoring every slight change in her vitals. Sara stayed longer than she needed to, unable to walk away. She watched Lucy breathe, watched the rise and fall of her chest, willing her to keep fighting. Just past midnight, Lucy stirred slightly in her bed, her eyelids fluttering as she regained some consciousness. Sara leaned in, her heart pounding as she saw the older woman's eyes open, just a sliver. It was a sign, a small one, but a sign nonetheless, that Lucy was still in the fight. Sara reached out, gently placing her hand over Lucy's frail one. "You're going to be okay," she whispered softly, unsure if Lucy could hear her, but needing to say it anyway. Lucy's fingers twitched ever so slightly in response, and for the first time that day, Sara allowed herself a moment of hope. The soft glow of the early morning sun began to creep through the windows of the hospital room. Lucy Collins lay motionless on the bed, her breathing slow and steady, though each breath seemed like a fragile thread connecting her to life. Sara Woods stood by her bedside, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but her mind was too active to allow any rest. The weight of the last 24 hours clung to her, not just from the medical challenges, but from the emotional realization that she had almost allowed this woman to slip through her fingers. Lucy's vitals were holding steady, but Sara knew better than to get comfortable. The elderly woman was still vulnerable, and any slight shift in her condition could tip the balance between life and death. It was a delicate waiting game, one that Sara had played countless times before, but this time it felt different. This time, there was a personal stake in the outcome. She didn't just want Lucy to survive. She needed her to survive, as if Lucy's recovery would somehow justify the mistakes Sara had made. Dr. Ethan Reyes entered the room quietly, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace that had settled there. He glanced at Lucy's monitors, nodding slightly at the stable readings. Then he looked at Sara, his expression a mixture of concern and understanding. "You've been here all night," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "You should get some rest." Sara shook her head, her eyes not leaving Lucy's face. "I can't," she replied. "Not yet. I need to be here." Ethan sighed, pulling up a chair next to her. He wasn't going to push the issue. He knew better than anyone what it felt like to carry the weight of a patient's life on your shoulders, especially when there was more than just medicine at play. He sat in silence with her for a few minutes, the two of them sharing the unspoken bond that comes from facing life and death side by side. "She's a fighter," Ethan said after a while, breaking the silence. "You saw how she reacted last night. It's small, but it's a good sign." Sara nodded, her hands resting on the bed railing. "I know," she whispered, "but I can't shake the feeling that if something goes wrong now, it'll be my fault. I hesitated when I shouldn't have." Ethan turned to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We all make mistakes, Sara, but the thing that defines us isn't the mistake itself. It's what we do after. You caught yourself in time, and now you're doing everything you can to help her. That's what matters." Sara looked at him, grateful for his words, but still not fully able to forgive herself. She had spent her career building a reputation as a doctor who didn't make mistakes, as someone who always got it right. And now, Standing on the edge of failure, she wasn't sure if she knew how to handle the possibility of not being perfect. Lucy stirred slightly in her bed, her eyelids fluttering open for a brief moment before closing again. Sara's heart leaped in her chest, and she leaned in closer, searching for any sign of awareness. It was fleeting, but it was there, a small, fragile spark of life that reminded them both that Lucy wasn't done fighting yet. Ethan smiled softly. "See, she's still in there. We just need to give her time." Sara exhaled, a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "I know," she said quietly, "but time is the one thing we can never predict. We don't know how much she has left." Ethan stood up, stretching slightly. "That's true, but that's why we have to make the most of the time we do have. It's all about giving her the best chance possible." He paused for a moment, looking at Sara with a thoughtful expression. "You're not alone in this, you know. We're all in it together." The words hung in the air, a reminder that despite the personal battles each of them faced, they were part of something bigger, a team, a collective effort to save lives, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Sara nodded, feeling a small sense of comfort in the fact that Ethan understood. He had been there too many times to count, and yet he always found a way to push through, to keep going. As the day went on, Lucy's condition remained stable but fragile. Her body was fighting the infection, but her age and weakened state made every small improvement feel like a victory. Sara and Ethan kept a close watch on her, adjusting medications, checking vitals, and ensuring that every step they took was carefully calculated. In between rounds, Sara found herself thinking back to the first moment she saw Lucy in the emergency room. She remembered the quick, dismissive thoughts that had flashed through her mind, the way she had immediately categorized Lucy based on appearance alone. It was a habit she hadn't realized she had developed, but now it was painfully clear. How many other patients had she judged too quickly? How many others had she failed because of her own assumptions? The thought gnawed at her, even as she tried to focus on the task at hand. Every time she looked at Lucy, lying there so vulnerable, Sara felt a pang of guilt. But alongside that guilt, something else had begun to stir within her, a determination to change. This case had opened her eyes in a way that nothing else had before. She couldn't go back to being the doctor she was before. She had to be better, not just for Lucy, but for every patient who walked through the doors of this hospital. Late in the afternoon, Sara found herself alone in Lucy's room once again. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the walls. Sara sat by the bed, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the blanket. "You're not alone," she whispered softly, more to herself than to Lucy. "And I'm not going to let you slip away." The quiet hum of the machines was the only response. But somehow, in that moment, Sara felt a sense of peace. She had made mistakes, yes, but she was here now. And as long as Lucy was still fighting, so was she. The days following Lucy's surgery were a blur of activity and quiet moments of waiting. Her condition had stabilized, but she was far from out of the woods. Sara Woods kept a close watch, her eyes scanning the monitors every few minutes, looking for any small change that might signal progress or trouble. The tension in the air was almost palpable, but there was a quiet determination in Sara now that hadn't been there before. She wasn't going to make the same mistakes. Lucy's family had yet to arrive. They were unreachable, somewhere caught up in the mundanities of life, unaware of how close they had come to losing her. The nurses had left messages, but so far, no one had responded. Sara couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration at the thought. How could someone's loved ones just not show up? But then again, she reminded herself, maybe they didn't know. Maybe they didn't understand how fragile life could be, how quickly it could slip away without warning. As Sara moved through her rounds, she found herself lost in thought more often than usual. The hospital bustled with its usual rhythm. Nurses wheeling carts, doctors conferring in hushed tones. But to Sara, it all seemed muted, as though she were watching it through a glass wall. She kept thinking back to Lucy and to the countless other patients she had treated over the years. How many of them had stories like Lucy's? How many had been dismissed because they didn't fit the neat, clinical picture doctors often looked for? She paused for a moment outside the room, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Lucy lay quietly in the bed, her breathing slow and steady, though her face still bore the lines of exhaustion and pain. There was a soft beeping of the machines, a steady reminder that time moved forward, whether they were ready for it or not. "Morning, Lucy," Sara said softly as she pulled up a chair next to the bed. She didn't expect a response, not yet, but speaking to her had become a habit, a way of maintaining some connection, even when Lucy's mind was still wandering in its own silent world. "You're doing better today," she continued. "We're going to get you through this." A part of Sara wondered whether Lucy could hear her. Sometimes, patients in deep recovery picked up on the world around them in ways that doctors didn't fully understand. Perhaps, deep inside, Lucy knew she wasn't alone, that someone was rooting for her, fighting for her even when she couldn't fight for herself. It was a comforting thought, one that helped Sara push through the long hours. Dr. Ethan Reyes appeared at the door, his usual calm demeanor masking the stress that only another doctor could recognize. He gave Sara a nod as he stepped inside, looking over Lucy's chart. "How's she doing today?" he asked, though the question was mostly routine. Both of them knew the answer before Sara even spoke. "She's stable," Sara replied, glancing at the machines. "Her vitals are holding steady, but there's still a long road ahead. We'll need to monitor her closely for any signs of infection." Ethan nodded, his gaze thoughtful as he reviewed the data. "It's a good sign that she's still holding on," he said quietly. "At her age, it's not easy to bounce back from something like this, but she's got strength. It's obvious." Sara looked at him, her eyes searching his for some reassurance, even though she knew he was right. "Do you think I acted too late?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a question that had been gnawing at her for days, one that she hadn't dared to ask out loud until now. Ethan turned toward her, his expression softening. "You acted when it mattered," he said gently. "There's no use in looking back. What's important is what you're doing now. You're here. You're making sure she's getting the best care possible. That's what counts." Sara nodded, though the words did little to ease the guilt that weighed on her chest. She had learned a hard lesson with Lucy, one that had shaken her to the core. But she was determined to grow from it, to be the kind of doctor who didn't make assumptions, who looked beyond the surface. Lucy had opened her eyes in a way no other patient ever had. The afternoon sun began to filter through the windows, casting soft beams of light across the room. Lucy's breathing was deep and even, and for the first time in days, Sara felt a flicker of hope. There was still a long way to go, but maybe, just maybe, they would get through this together. As the hours passed, Sara found herself reflecting on the many decisions she had made over the years. She had always prided herself on being efficient, on knowing the answer before the problem even fully presented itself. But this case had taught her that sometimes slowing down and taking a moment to really see a patient, beyond the symptoms, beyond the numbers, was just as important as any diagnosis. And it wasn't just Lucy who had taught her this. There had been others, patients who had slipped through her memory, forgotten in the rush of hospital life. Faces that had blurred together over time, until they were nothing more than fleeting images in the back of her mind. Sara had spent so long building her career, focusing on the next surgery, the next challenge, that she had lost sight of the very thing that had drawn her to medicine in the first place: the people. She glanced at Lucy once more, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. Somewhere out there, Lucy's family was still unaware of how close they had come to losing her. But here, in this small room, there was hope. And that was enough for now. Sara stood, stretching her tired muscles. "I'll be back," she whispered to Lucy, though she wasn't sure if the woman could hear her. "You just keep fighting." As she stepped out of the room, she took one last look at the frail figure lying in the bed. Something had changed in Sara, something deep and fundamental. She wasn't just a doctor anymore, someone who treated symptoms and moved on. She was part of Lucy's fight now, just as much as Lucy was part of hers. The silence of the hospital room was broken only by the steady beeping of machines monitoring Lucy's vitals. Days had passed since her emergency surgery, and although she remained in a fragile state, there were small signs of improvement. Little victories that both Dr. Ethan Reyes and Sara Woods clung to. But one thing weighed heavily on their minds. Lucy's family had yet to arrive. Despite multiple calls and messages, the hospital staff had received no word from her relatives. That changed one crisp morning when Sara noticed two figures hesitantly entering the hospital lobby. A middle-aged woman holding the hand of a young man, both with expressions of deep worry etched into their faces. The resemblance was striking. This had to be Lucy's daughter, Anna, and her grandson, Daniel. After being informed of Lucy's condition, the two had dropped everything and rushed to Los Angeles. Their faces were pale with the shock of the news they had just received. Sara, having anticipated their arrival, approached them gently. "You must be Lucy's family. I'm Dr. Sara Woods," she said, offering her hand. Anna took it with a shaky grip, her eyes red from what Sara imagined had been long hours of travel and worry. "Yes, I'm her daughter," Anna said, her voice strained but controlled. "I didn't realize it was this serious. The last time I spoke to her, she didn't mention anything about being in pain." Sara nodded sympathetically. "Your mother has been through a lot. She didn't come to the hospital until the pain became unbearable. By the time she arrived, it was almost too late." She paused, watching as Anna processed her words. "But she's a fighter. The surgery was successful, and she's stable for now. We're doing everything we can to support her recovery." Anna sighed, relief mixing with the guilt that clouded her expression. "I should have been here sooner. I should have known something was wrong. She never tells me when she's in pain." Her voice cracked, and Daniel squeezed her hand tightly. Sara had seen this before. Family members who blamed themselves for not being there when it mattered most. She understood the impulse to feel responsible, but now wasn't the time for guilt. Now was the time for strength. "The important thing is that you're here now," Sara reassured them. "Your presence is going to make all the difference in her recovery." Together, they made their way to Lucy's room. As they entered, Anna's breath caught in her throat. Lucy looked small, frail, almost unrecognizable beneath the hospital blankets. The beeping of the machines and the softness of oxygen filled the air, but Lucy's face was calm, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the family. Daniel hesitated at the door, unsure if he should approach, but Anna pulled him forward gently. "Mom," Anna whispered as she took her mother's hand. Lucy didn't respond, her eyes remaining closed, but her breathing remained steady. Daniel stood back, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of his grandmother, someone who had always been strong, now looking so vulnerable. Sara stood at the back of the room, giving them a moment of privacy. She knew from experience that the presence of family could be more powerful than any medical treatment. There was something about the connection between loved ones that could heal wounds the body alone could not. After a few moments, Anna turned to Sara, wiping the tears from her face. "How long will it take for her to recover? Will she be okay?" The questions came in a rapid rush, each one tinged with desperation. Sara stepped closer, her voice calm but honest. "It's hard to say exactly how long her recovery will take. She's stable for now, but she'll need to be monitored for any signs of infection or complications. She's been through a lot and her body is fragile. But with you here, giving her support, she has a much better chance." Anna nodded, though it was clear she was holding back tears. "I just feel so helpless." She always kept things to herself, never wanting to burden anyone. She looked at Sara with a pained expression. "But she's my mother. I should have known." Sara placed a hand on Anna's shoulder, offering what comfort she could. Sometimes, people hide their pain because they don't want to worry those they love. Lucy might not have wanted you to see her in this condition, But what matters now is that you're here for her. She needs that more than anything." Daniel finally spoke up, his voice quiet but steady. "What can we do for her now?" he asked, his eyes still focused on his grandmother's frail figure. Sara smiled softly at him, appreciating the strength he was showing despite the situation. "The best thing you can do is be here. Talk to her, hold her hand, remind her that she's not alone. The doctors and nurses will handle the medical side of things, but you can give her something we can't: hope." As they stood by Lucy's bedside, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The presence of her family seemed to fill the space with warmth, despite the cold, sterile surroundings. For the first time in days, the mood felt less like a fight for survival and more like the beginning of a healing process. Ethan stepped in shortly after, nodding to Sara as he reviewed the latest updates on Lucy's condition. He quietly pulled Sara aside, his face thoughtful. "I think she's improving," he said in a low voice. "Her vitals are stronger than they were yesterday, and she's responding well to the post-surgery care." Sara exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "That's good news," she replied, her voice lighter than it had been in days. "I just hope the family being here makes a difference." "It will," Ethan said confidently. "Patients like Lucy, they need more than just medical treatment. They need to know there's something worth fighting for. Family can do that." As Sara and Ethan stepped back, allowing the family to spend time with Lucy, Sara couldn't help but reflect on how much this case had changed her. She had entered the medical field driven by a desire to heal, to fix things. But she had forgotten that healing was not just a matter of medicine and procedures. It was about connecting with people, understanding their lives, and seeing beyond the symptoms. Looking back at Lucy's family, Sara realized that this was more than just a case. It was a reminder of why she had become a doctor in the first place. The weight of the responsibilities she carried, the power she held to change lives, had never felt heavier, but it also had never felt more meaningful. The days that followed were a blur of cautious optimism and lingering fear. Lucy's condition had stabilized, but the doctors warned Anna and Daniel that the recovery would be slow and delicate. With every passing day, Lucy grew a little stronger, though she still had a long way to go. The atmosphere in her hospital room was somber yet hopeful, and the presence of her family played a crucial role in keeping her spirits up. Anna spent most of her time by her mother's bedside, talking to her in soft tones, recounting old family stories and reminding her of happier times. Daniel, despite his initial hesitance, also grew more comfortable being near his grandmother. He would sit with her, reading aloud from a book or simply holding her hand in silence. Every small gesture seemed to give Lucy the strength she needed to keep fighting. But there was still a shadow that loomed over the family: Sara Woods' treatment of Lucy when she first arrived. Anna couldn't shake the memory of the doctor's initial neglect, how Sara had dismissed Lucy's pain as something trivial, and how that nearly cost Lucy her life. Anna had tried to focus on her mother's recovery, but the bitterness remained. It gnawed at her, an unresolved knot that refused to untangle. One afternoon, as Anna sat by Lucy's side, Sara knocked softly on the door and entered the room. She looked different than before. Her usual confidence was replaced by an air of hesitation. Her eyes held a mix of regret and determination, and she took a deep breath before speaking. "Anna, Daniel, I wanted to speak with you both," Sara began, her voice quieter than usual. Anna glanced up, her expression hardening. Daniel looked between them, sensing the tension but unsure what to expect. Sara shifted on her feet, visibly uncomfortable. "I know I haven't been the doctor you or your mother deserved," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "When Lucy first arrived here, I made assumptions about her, and I was wrong. I didn't take her pain seriously, and because of that, I almost failed her." Anna's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, waiting for Sara to continue. The words she had wanted to say for days were at the tip of her tongue, but something in Sara's demeanor made her pause. "I've been a doctor for many years, and sometimes I forget that my patients are more than just the symptoms they present," Sara continued, her gaze dropping to the floor. But your mother, Lucy, reminded me of why I became a doctor in the first place. She reminded me that every person who walks through those doors deserves to be seen and heard. Daniel looked over at his mother, then back to Sara. So, what are you saying? He asked, his tone cautious. Sara met his eyes, then Anna's. I'm saying that I'm sorry, truly sorry, and I want to make it right. I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to help your mother in any way I can from now on. I want to earn back the trust that I lost. For a moment, the room was heavy with silence. Anna could feel the anger bubbling inside her, but alongside it was something else, exhaustion. She had been angry for so long, holding on to the resentment like a shield to protect her from the fear and helplessness she had felt when her mother was on the brink of death. But now, with Sara standing before her, vulnerable and sincere, that anger began to unravel. You almost killed her, Anna said, her voice quiet but filled with pain. You treated her like she was nothing, like she didn't matter. How can I forgive that? Sara didn't flinch. She knew she deserved those words. I understand why you feel that way, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I will do everything in my power to make sure that from here on out, Lucy gets the best care possible. And I'll make sure no one else in this hospital is treated the way she was. Anna looked at her mother, still fragile but alive, breathing steadily under the soft light of the hospital room. She thought of how far they had come, how close they had been to losing her. And as much as she wanted to hold on to her anger, she couldn't help but see the genuine remorse in Sara's eyes. Just don't let this happen again, Anna finally said, her voice weary. Not to anyone. Sara nodded, relief washing over her face. I won't. I promise. She hesitated for a moment, then added, if you ever need anything, questions, concerns, updates, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm here for Lucy and for you. With that, Sara quietly left the room, leaving Anna and Daniel alone with their thoughts. The air felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, casting a soft glow through the window, Lucy stirred in her bed. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for the first time in days, she managed to speak in a faint, raspy voice. Anna, Daniel, you're here. Anna rushed to her side, tears welling up in her eyes. Yes, Mom, we're here. We're right here. Lucy smiled weakly, her hand reaching out to touch Anna's face. I knew you'd come. Daniel stepped forward, taking Lucy's other hand. We wouldn't be anywhere else, Grandma. As they stood by her bedside, the family reunited and strengthened by the ordeal they had faced together, Anna realized something important. Healing wasn't just about the body. It was about the heart, too. And though the pain and anger she had felt were real, they didn't have to define her or her mother's recovery. In that moment, surrounded by the love and support of her family, Anna began to let go. Sara Woods walked out of the hospital room, her heart heavy but also slightly lighter after finally apologizing to Anna and Daniel. It had taken all her courage to admit her mistake, but she knew it was the right thing to do. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Lucy's case had shaken her deeply, and her neglect could have cost a life. That thought weighed heavily on her mind as she made her way to her office. For years, Sara had prided herself on being a skilled doctor, someone who was able to stay calm under pressure, who could make quick decisions. But this time, she had let her bias cloud her judgment, and she had made a mistake that nearly destroyed a family. As she sat down behind her desk, she began to replay the events in her mind, trying to figure out how she had gone so wrong. She thought back to the day Lucy was admitted to the hospital. Her clothes had been torn and dirty, her appearance disheveled, and in Sara's exhausted state, she had immediately assumed that Lucy was another homeless person suffering from addiction. She hadn't taken the time to listen, hadn't really looked at her. It was a stark reminder that, in the chaos of her daily work, she had started seeing patients as problems to be solved, rather than people to be cared for. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Dr. Vinicius, his expression serious but not unkind. "Sara, we need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She braced herself, knowing this conversation had been coming ever since the incident. "Look, I know you've already apologized to the family, and I appreciate that," Dr. Vinicius began, sitting down across from her. "But we both know this isn't just about one case. You're a good doctor, Sara, but lately, I think you've lost sight of what that means. We all make mistakes, but this one was a wake-up call." Sara looked down at her hands, not able to meet his gaze. "I know, Vinicius. I messed up. I know I need to do better, and I will. I didn't realize how far I'd strayed from why I became a doctor in the first place." Dr. Vinicius leaned forward, his voice firm but compassionate. "It's easy to lose perspective when you're working under this much pressure, but you have to remember that every patient is someone's mother, someone's father, sister, or friend. We can't afford to treat them as numbers, or worse, ignore their humanity because we're too tired or stressed. It's our responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen." Sara nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She had been running on autopilot for so long. She had forgotten why she was here in the first place. It was time to change that. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right," she promised, finally looking up at him. "Not just for Lucy, but for all my patients. I don't want to be that doctor anymore." Vinicius smiled softly. "That's the first step, but there are going to be consequences, Sara. The hospital board is reviewing the incident, and you might face disciplinary action. It's out of my hands." Sara took a deep breath. She had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. "I understand. Whatever they decide, I'll accept it. I deserve it." Vinicius stood up, giving her a reassuring nod. "I know this is tough, but you're doing the right thing by owning up to it. And no matter what happens, you're still one of the best doctors here. Don't forget that." After Vinicius left, Sara sat alone in her office, reflecting on what he had said. Facing the hospital board wasn't going to be easy, but she knew it was necessary. This experience had changed her, and it wasn't something she could walk away from without consequences. But she was determined to learn from it, to become a better doctor and a better person. As the day of the board hearing approached, Sara prepared herself for the worst. She knew that losing her job was a possibility, but she also knew that this wasn't just about her career. It was about making sure that she never let another patient down the way she had let Lucy down. She had to take responsibility for her actions, no matter the cost. The night before the hearing, Sara sat in her apartment, going over her notes and thinking about the conversation she'd had with Anna and Daniel. Their faces still haunted her, especially Anna's words. "You almost killed her." She had never felt such deep shame, but she knew that Anna's anger was justified. As she looked out of her window, watching the lights of Los Angeles flicker in the distance, Sara made a silent vow. No matter what happened tomorrow, she would never forget the lessons she had learned from this experience. She would find a way to make amends, to earn back the trust she had lost, and to make sure that every patient she treated from now on would be given the care and respect they deserved. The day of the hospital board hearing had finally arrived. Sara Woods stood outside the meeting room, her stomach tied in knots. She had been through countless high-pressure situations before, surgeries, emergencies, but this felt different. This time, she wasn't walking into a room to save someone's life. She was walking in to answer for a grave mistake, one that could end her career. The hospital board consisted of senior doctors, administrators, and legal advisors. They sat behind a long table, their faces neutral but serious. Sara felt the weight of their gazes as she took her seat. Across from her, Dr. Vinicius sat as well, his expression calm yet concerned. He had been a supportive colleague throughout this ordeal, but he couldn't change what was about to happen. The chair of the board, Dr. Morgan, a seasoned surgeon with decades of experience, began the proceedings. "Dr. Woods, we are here to review the incident involving your treatment of a patient, Lucy Walters, which resulted in a life-threatening oversight. This hearing is to determine the appropriate consequences for your actions. You have the floor." Sara took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she stood up. She had prepared for this moment, but no amount of preparation could ease the heaviness in her chest. "Thank you, Dr. Morgan," she began, her voice steady but quiet. "I am here today to take full responsibility for my actions. I failed my patient, Lucy Walters, by not giving her the care and attention she deserved. I allowed my judgment to be clouded by assumptions, and I made a mistake that could have cost her life." The room was silent, except for the soft sound of someone shifting in their seat. Sara continued. Knowing that this was her only chance to show the board, she understood the gravity of her actions. "I recognize that in my role as a physician, there is no room for such errors. My duty is to every patient who walks through the hospital doors, regardless of their appearance, circumstances, or background. And in Lucy's case, I failed to uphold that duty." She paused for a moment, glancing at Dr. Vinicius, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Since the incident, I have taken steps to reflect on what happened and to ensure that I never make the same mistake again. I have sought mentorship, attended additional training sessions on patient care, and committed myself to being more present with every patient I treat. I cannot change the past, but I am determined to learn from it and become a better doctor." Dr. Morgan looked down at the papers in front of him before speaking. "Dr. Woods, we appreciate your honesty and your willingness to take responsibility. However, this incident raised significant concerns not only about your conduct, but about the broader implications for patient safety. We have to consider whether disciplinary action is warranted to ensure that such mistakes are not repeated." Sara nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about setting a precedent for the entire hospital. Mistakes like hers couldn't be overlooked, and she respected that. But she also knew that she had changed, that she had learned from this painful experience. The board deliberated in silence for several minutes, the tension in the room thick. Sara's heart raced as she waited for their decision, every second feeling like an eternity. She couldn't help but think about Lucy and her family, about the trust she had broken and the harm she had caused. No punishment would ever erase the guilt she felt, but she hoped the board would see that she was committed to making amends. Finally, Dr. Morgan cleared his throat. "Dr. Woods, the board has reviewed the evidence, your statement, and the circumstances surrounding this case. We recognize your willingness to take responsibility and your efforts to rectify the situation. However, given the severity of the incident, we have decided that disciplinary action is necessary." Sara braced herself, feeling the weight of their judgment settle on her shoulders. "As a result of this hearing," Dr. Morgan continued, "you will be placed on a 3-month probationary period, during which your patient interactions will be closely monitored. Additionally, we are requiring you to complete a mandatory training program focused on patient empathy and care." Sara felt a mixture of relief and shame wash over her. It wasn't as harsh as she had feared. She wouldn't lose her job, but the probation and training were clear indicators that she had a long road ahead to rebuild trust. She glanced at Dr. Vinicius, who offered her a small, supportive smile. "I understand," Sara said quietly. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to prove that I can do better." The board members nodded, and Dr. Morgan wrapped up the meeting. As Sara left the room, she felt emotionally drained but also determined. The probation period would be challenging, but it was her chance to show that she had truly learned from this experience. She wasn't the same doctor who had walked into that ER room with Lucy Walters, and she was going to prove it. Walking out of the hospital into the crisp evening air, Sara reflected on how far she had come since that fateful day. She still had much to learn, much to prove, but she felt a sense of clarity. Her journey was far from over. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would make sure that no patient ever felt unseen or unheard under her care again. 3 months later, Sara Woods stood in the hospital hallway, watching as a patient was wheeled past her toward the emergency room. It was a routine scene, one she had witnessed countless times before. But today it felt different. Today marked the end of her probationary period. For the past 3 months, Every move she made had been scrutinized, every decision evaluated. It had been a humbling experience, but one that she was grateful for. She had learned more about herself and her approach to medicine in those months than in all the years she had spent training. Under the watchful eye of her supervisors, Sara had worked tirelessly to regain the trust of her colleagues and, most importantly, her patients. Each case she handled during that time had been an opportunity to prove that she had changed, that she was no longer the doctor who had let assumptions guide her actions. As she made her rounds, Sara reflected on how her probation had been more than just a professional test. It had been a personal journey. She had learned to slow down, to listen, and to see every patient as a person with a story, not just a case to be solved. Lucy Walters had taught her that painful lesson, and it was one Sara would never forget. That afternoon, Sara found herself standing outside Lucy's room. Lucy had been back for a follow-up appointment to monitor her recovery from the surgery that had saved her life. Her health had improved significantly, and she was no longer the fragile, desperate woman Sara had initially failed to see. Now, Lucy was sitting up in bed, chatting with her mother and daughter, her face glowing with health. Sara hesitated at the door, wondering if Lucy would want to see her. Over the past months, they had spoken a few times, but there was always an unspoken tension between them, an acknowledgement of the mistake that had almost cost Lucy her life. Sara couldn't change the past, but she hoped Lucy knew how deeply she regretted what had happened. Gathering her courage, Sara knocked softly on the door. Lucy's mother looked up and smiled, but it was Lucy who spoke first. "Come in, Dr. Woods." Sara stepped inside, offering a small smile. "Hi, Lucy. I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." "I'm doing much better, thanks to you," Lucy said, her voice warm but steady. "I heard about your probation. I know it must have been tough." Sara nodded, grateful for Lucy's understanding. It was, but it was also necessary. I needed to change, to really understand the weight of what happened. Lucy nodded thoughtfully, and for the first time since the incident, she reached out and took Sara's hand. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them. You saved my life in the end, and for that, I'm grateful." The words hit Sara like a wave of relief. She had spent months carrying the guilt of her failure, but hearing Lucy's forgiveness lifted a burden she hadn't realized was so heavy. "Thank you," Sara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you know." As she left the room, Sara felt a sense of closure. The probation had ended, and Lucy had forgiven her. But Sara knew this was just the beginning of a new phase in her career. She had been given a second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. Outside, the Los Angeles sky was a brilliant shade of orange as the sun began to set. Sara stood for a moment, watching the light fade and thinking about how far she had come. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. The mistakes of her past would always be with her, but they no longer defined her. She was ready to move forward with empathy, patience, and a renewed commitment to her work. As Sara walked away from the hospital that evening, she felt lighter, freer. She wasn't the same doctor she had been before Lucy Walters had entered her life, and that was a good thing. She was better now, stronger, wiser, and more aware of the responsibility she carried with each patient she treated. It was time for a new beginning, one where every decision would be made with care, and every patient would be seen as they truly were, a person deserving of compassion and respect. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.